Greetings and welcome to the second video of our Mastering the edTPA series. As always, I'm Jeremy Delamarter, the edTPA coordinator at Northwest University, and I'm happy to be talking to you today to answer the simple question, what is the edTPA? In video 1, we looked at the history of the edTPA, how it came to be, and the social and political forces that brought it into being. But today we are going to talk about what it is, how it is structured, what activities you will be doing during the edTPA. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a much clearer understanding of what the edTPA is, and more importantly, what it is not. There are rumors, I'm sure, circulating and flying about that have scared you into this frenzy about this massive undertaking that's in front of you. And while I'm not going to claim that it's not a lot of work, because it is not a mystery. It is not a cipher that you must somehow solve, or a mystery that you must unpack when you find the clues. Instead, the edTPA is a well-structured, predictable, and I think fairly useful tool for your own growth. So that's what we're talking about today. What is the edTPA and how is it structured? So to begin, what is the edTPA? First off, there's an acronym there, edTPA. TPA stands for Teacher Performance Assessment. Instead of you taking a test about your knowledge or writing a paper about what you understand, the edTPA is designed to actually assess your performance as a teacher. So this is not a theoretical or abstract assessment. This is an actual assessment of your actual performance during student teaching. For some people that might be scary. I actually think that contextualized information is always good. The edTPA is divided into 3 related tasks, and a quick note here about vocabulary. The edTPA talks about task 1, task 2, and task 3. And when it does, what it's referring to are these 3 separate tasks. So the edTPA is divided into 3 parts, and we will call them from this point on task 1, task 2, and task 3. Well, task 1 is context and planning. You will provide context for your classroom, your actual student teaching classroom, not a theoretical classroom, the actual classroom with the actual students in which you student teach. And you will create a plan, including lesson plans and a rationale for those plans, for a small unit in your classroom. This plan will be based on the endorsement that you choose to do the edTPA in. So if you are studying, let's say, special education and elementary education, you can choose which one of those you want to do your edTPA in. Likewise, if you are studying secondary math and ELL, you could choose which one of those you want to do your edTPA in. The second task, task 2, is all about your instruction. You will actually teach the lessons that you planned in task 1, and you will provide evidence of your effective and quality instruction. And then task 3 is simply to gather data from students, assess students based on what you said you were going to do in task 1 and what you did in task 2. Gather the information, the student work, assess it. How did they do? Did they meet the learning targets or not? And then create a response. What's next? If they met the learning targets, what would you do next? If they didn't, what's your next step? By the way, as an aside, I hope none of this seems unfamiliar. In fact, I'm hoping that this is all very comforting, because this is the kind of work you should already be doing in your classroom. More on that later. The edTPA is conducted during student teaching with real student data, and I cannot emphasize this enough. Much of your coursework is going to deal with theories and with hypotheticals. The edTPA is neither of those. It is real students, real data, real planning for real situations. So again, I want to emphasize this. This is not the time for talking about what you might do in a given context. This is what you will do with real people. As I'm sure you know, the edTPA is high stakes. And what that means is simply that you have to pass it in order to be certified in Washington State. There is talk about creating an alternative, an alternative assessment for special situations. So far, those have not materialized. If and when they do, I will update this video and update you. But right now, as it stands in Washington State, you have to pass the edTPA in order to be certified. And at Northwest University, the edTPA is mandated for both program completion and teacher certification. Now, what that means is, in order to graduate from Northwest, you have to submit the edTPA. You do not have to pass it in order to graduate. You can receive your degree from Northwest without passing the edTPA, but you do have to submit it. In order to be certified by the state, however, you must pass it. Okay, this is a very brief overview. Let's go into a little bit more detail about how the edTPA is structured. Task 1. You're going to plan for instruction in your specific context and with your specific students. And so you will be required to fill out forms that describe the context. It's called a context for learning form. We'll talk more about that in subsequent videos. Who are your students? What is the demographic of your classroom and your school? If you have students with IEPs or 504s, what are their IEPs and 504s? Do you have ELL students? Do you have students with behavioral needs? You have a form that you will fill out that describes all of that, and it provides context for the scorers to know about you and your classroom. You will create at least 3 sequential lesson plans. Again, these are lesson plans based on the endorsement that you have chosen. And you will plan out, what will I do for these students for this lesson? What will the assessments be? What instructional resources will I use? What activities will be happening? What are the learning targets that we'll be trying to meet? This is lesson planning you have already learned how to do in our program. It will not be new. You will be highly familiar with it by the time you actually do this. And then you will fill out a commentary in which you write reflections that explain the plans that you made based on the context. Given what you described in the context for learning, why are these plans the right plans for your students? The task 1 will be scored according to the first 5 rubrics. So we will look at the rubrics again in subsequent videos. But for now, what I want you to understand is that rubric 1, rubric 2, 3, 4, and 5 all contribute to your task 1 score. So when you receive your score at the end of edTPA, when you've submitted it, you will receive scores for rubric 1, rubric 2, rubric 3, rubric 4, and rubric 5, and those will reflect your performance on task 1. Task 2. You will teach the classes that you planned in task 1. And I have to be very clear about this. You need to do the classes you actually planned in task 1. So in task 1, if you planned to do 3 sequential lessons, say on dividing fractions, the lessons you teach in task 2 and that you record for task 2 need to be those 3 lessons that you planned on dividing fractions. Occasionally, students get into their minds that tasks 1, 2, and 3 are totally unrelated to each other, and they record different lessons than they wrote about in task 1. That will be an automatic failure if you do that. Don't do that. So, the classes that you planned in task 1, you will actually teach in task 2. You will videotape yourself interacting with students to deepen their understanding. We will talk a great deal about this videotaping in subsequent videos. And then you will write reflections that explain your instructional decision making. Why did you do what you did? In task 1, you told us why what you plan to do is right for your students. In task 2, you will say, why did I do what I did? What evidence did students show? What evidence did I show that I have demonstrated effective teaching? And task 2 is scored on rubrics 6 through 10. So just as there are 5 rubrics for task 1, there are 5 rubrics for task 2. Finally, in task 3, you will collect and analyze student work. Way back in task 1, when you wrote your lesson plans, you told us about the assessments that you were going to use to analyze or to gather data on student performance. In task 3, you will actually gather that data that you said you were going to gather, and you will analyze it. Did students meet the learning target? If they didn't, where did they fall short? If they did, what evidence do you have that they did? You will identify high and low performers. You'll pull out focus students, and you will give appropriate feedback to those students. And you will share that feedback with the scores, whether it was written feedback or for kindergartners, maybe it was verbal and you talked to them and so you videotaped that. And then you will write reflections that explain, why was this appropriate feedback? Why did I respond to students in the way that I did? What evidence did students give me that showed that they met the learning targets? And then you will talk about your next steps. Based on student performance, what do I do now? Again, I hope that none of this is surprising or new or shocking. This should be the things that we're already doing. You're scored on 5 rubrics, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 for task 3. So what I'd like you to see is that there are 5 rubrics for each of the tasks, which adds up to a total of 15 rubrics. Each task is scored 1 through 5. So if you got all 1s, you would only get 15 points. If you got all 3s, you would end up with 3 times 15, which is 45. And if you got all 5s, and by the way, that has never happened in the history of the edTPA in Washington State. No one has ever scored all 5s. Please do not hold yourself to that standard. But if you were to score all 5s, you would get 75 points. So there are 75 possible points for the edTPA. Do not shoot for that 75. I don't think it's actually possible to get. It's possible on paper, but given the space constraints that you have and the time constraints, I don't know how it could be done. What I do want you to know, though, is that right now, as of the 2019-2020 school year, a passing score on the edTPA is 40. So think about that for 1 second. If there are 75 possible points, to pass the edTPA, you only have to get 40. If you scored a 3, which is at standard, on everything across the edTPA, you'd have a 45. And what that means is you can actually score below a 3 on a couple of the rubrics and still pass the edTPA. You do not have to be perfect. There is a lot of room for things to be okay. That's okay. And you pass. I want to reiterate this. Many people feel like they need to knock this thing out of the park. And while we absolutely want you to score as well as you can, what we mostly want is for you to pass. The passing score for the edTPA in the 2019-2020 school year is 40. This should be encouraging because you don't have to be perfect. You do have to be strategic, which is what we're going to talk about now. The work of the edTPA, the teaching that you have to demonstrate in the edTPA, essentially boils down to strategic planning, planning with your students in mind, student-centered instruction, and data-driven assessment. These are all things that you are learning about in our program, and they are all practices that you will be doing and getting better at and improving on during your student teaching. None of this should be unfamiliar to you. In fact, this is the kind of work that we hope you are doing, that we are preparing you for. The real trick of the edTPA is not the planning and the instruction and the assessment. That's all work you're already doing. The trick of the edTPA is to document these things in such a way that is palatable and digestible and meaningful to the state. And to say this again, the teaching, the instruction, the planning, the assessment, that is not the hard part of the edTPA because you're already doing that. You should be teaching that way. This is how we are teaching you to teach. The hard part of the edTPA is documenting it in the way that they want it documented. And the bulk of our time in these videos and in your edTPA support is not going to be spent in teaching you how to plan or how to effectively teach students or how to assess. You'll be learning that in your other coursework. You'll be learning that in the field. The bulk of our time will be spent in helping you learn to document it in the way they want you to document it. By the way, this is setting you up very well for future evaluations such as TPEP or even national boards if you chose to go that route in the future. Students who have done the edTPA generally perform very well on TPEP evaluations when they are teachers, because they know how to document their activities. Okay, some points I want to emphasize and sum up. The edTPA is about your specific students in your specific student teaching context. It is not the time for generalities. For example, I differentiate according to student need. Yes, thank you. That's the definition of differentiation. What you would need to tell us for the edTPA is, what are your specific students' specific needs? And so specifically, how do you differentiate according to those specific needs? This is the second thing I want to make sure you know. The edTPA is an all or nothing test. You cannot pass task 1 and fail task 2 or 3. You pass the whole thing or you pass none of it. So individual tasks do not receive passing or failing scores. You will sometimes hear people from other programs or people you know say, oh yeah, I passed task 1, but I failed task 3. If they say that, you need to know they have a fundamental misunderstanding of how the edTPA works. You could do very, very well on task 1. Let's say you got 5s. That would give you 25 points. And then you could do very poorly on the subsequent tasks and still end up with a 40. You pass the edTPA. The distribution of the points does not matter. The total score of 40 is what matters. The only time it matters how they're distributed would be if you were to not pass. So if you scored a 39, then we would want to look at, well, where did you do well and where did you not do well, so we can figure out where it is that we're going to remediate and increase points. That's another conversation for another time. Right now, you need to know that you passed the whole edTPA or you passed none of it. The only score that matters is that aggregate sum total score of 40, your combined scores on all 3 tasks. And finally, the last point that I want to emphasize is the same one I ended with for video 1, and that's this. The edTPA will help you be a better teacher. Learning to document your activities in this way is actually going to help you reflect on your activities. Even though you're already doing that good teaching, the strategic planning, the student-centered instruction, the data-driven assessment, the edTPA will help you do it even better. I'm excited for you to be moving forward on this process. I'm looking forward to working with you in future videos and hopefully in person. In our next video, we're going to begin talking about the resources you have to support you during the edTPA process. For now, think about what you know about the edTPA and its structure, and be encouraged because it's playing to the strengths. It's playing to the things that you already know how to do.